Dr. Celeste Monroe had spent years mastering the delicate art of saving children's lives. The long nights, the endless studying, the sacrifices, it had all been worth it, until now. Until the boardroom full of people she once considered colleagues stared at her with a mix of pity and calculated indifference. The hospital administrator, a man who had once praised her for her precision in the operating room, folded his hands on the table and delivered the final blow. The board has decided to place you on indefinite suspension, pending further review. The words landed like a physical strike. Celeste sat still, back straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not here. Not in front of them. We understand this is difficult, he continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. But given the malpractice accusation, we have no choice. There is too much at stake. She knew exactly what was at stake: the hospital's reputation, its funding, its carefully curated image. It didn't matter that the accusation was unfounded, that she had done everything right during that surgery. It didn't matter that the parents of the patient had seemed confused when they were suddenly advised to seek legal action. It certainly didn't matter that her ex-husband, Vincent Drake, had long-standing ties to the hospital's largest donors. Celeste stood, her chair scraping against the polished floor. I dedicated my life to this hospital, she said, voice controlled but firm. To my patients. To medicine. You know this is absurd. No one met her gaze. She turned and walked out, each step echoing in the silent corridor. By the time she reached the parking garage, the weight of it hit her. She gripped the car door, inhaling sharply, willing herself not to cry. Not yet. When she arrived at the apartment, Ivy was sitting on the floor, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The 8-year-old looked up, her blue eyes too knowing. Mom? Celeste forced a smile, setting her bag down with deliberate ease. Hey, sweetheart. How was school? Ivy hesitated before answering. It was okay. But Jamie's moving. His dad got a new job. He said he's getting a big house with a pool. Celeste swallowed the knot in her throat. Her own daughter had just been forced to leave behind a home she had known since birth, a home with a bedroom that overlooked the city skyline, a kitchen where they had baked cookies on rainy afternoons, a bookshelf where Ivy's favorite stories lived. Now, they were here. A modest 2-bedroom apartment with beige walls and a carpet that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. That sounds nice, Celeste said, settling onto the couch, already sagging in the middle. Ivy studied her, the way children do when they sense something is wrong but don't quite have the words for it. Did your work get better? Celeste hesitated. She had always promised herself she would be honest with Ivy, but how did she explain this? How did she tell an 8-year-old that the life they had built had been torn apart by a man who was supposed to love them both? It's complicated, she finally said. Ivy nodded, as if this answer would do for now. She picked up one of her stuffed animals and hugged it to her chest. Are we gonna be okay? Celeste's throat tightened. She reached out, tucking a strand of Ivy's blonde hair behind her ear. Of course we are. Later that night, after Ivy had fallen asleep in a bed that was too small and too unfamiliar, Celeste sat at the tiny kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The hospital had been her identity, her purpose. Without it, what was she? She pulled up job listings, but nothing felt right. The idea of working at another hospital in the same city, where everyone knew what had happened, made her stomach turn. The thought of leaving, of uprooting Ivy even more, felt equally impossible. Her phone buzzed. A message from Vincent. Hope you're settling in. Let me know if you need anything. She stared at the screen, anger curling through her. Vincent never reached out unless he wanted something. And what he wanted was to see her fold, to see her struggle, to make her believe she couldn't survive without him. She deleted the message without responding. In the morning, she woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. Ivy was still curled under the blankets, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. Celeste sat up, rubbing a hand over her face. The weight of yesterday hadn't lifted. She needed a plan. She needed a way forward. And she needed to find it fast. Celeste sat at the kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen, the glow reflecting off her coffee cup. The job listings blurred together, private practices looking for pediatricians, understaffed hospitals advertising emergency openings, telehealth companies promising flexible hours and decent pay. None of it felt right. Every option required either moving far away or walking into a place where someone had already heard about her suspension. The apartment door rattled as the mail was dropped into the slot. She got up, stretching stiff shoulders, and retrieved a thin stack of envelopes. Bills, a grocery store flyer, an ad for a local gym that promised to transform your life in 30 days, and a letter that made her pause. The return address was a law firm in Maine. She frowned, turning it over in her hands before slicing it open with a butter knife. The letter inside was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper, the kind that usually carried bad news or summonses. Dr. Monroe. We regret to inform you of the passing of your great-aunt, Margaret Whitmore. Per her will, you have been named as the sole heir to her estate. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for the transfer of property. The rest of the letter listed a phone number, an address, and an invitation to come in person. Celeste read it twice. Then a third time. She had no idea who Margaret Whitmore was. Mom? Ivy's voice was thick with sleep as she wandered into the kitchen, hair a wild mess, clutching her stuffed rabbit by one floppy ear. Celeste forced a smile and folded the letter. Morning, sweetheart. Want some breakfast? She spent the rest of the day researching. Margaret Whitmore had lived in Seabrook, a small coastal town in Maine, population just under 3,000. The estate in question was referred to only as Whitmore House. There were no real estate listings, no photos, nothing to suggest what kind of place it was. Just the name, buried in county records. By evening, the idea had taken root. There was nothing keeping them here. No job, no stability, no reason to keep pretending things could go back to normal. Maybe this was a chance to start over. She clicked open a map, traced the route with her fingertip. It would be a long drive, but it was doable. 2 days later, they packed up what little they had. The car was filled with suitcases, Ivy's books, and a cooler stuffed with peanut butter sandwiches and juice boxes. As they pulled onto the highway, Celeste glanced at Ivy in the rearview mirror. Excited for an adventure? Ivy hugged her rabbit tighter. Will there be a beach? There's an ocean. And probably a beach. What if it's haunted? Celeste let out a short laugh. Then we'll have a very interesting story to tell. The drive stretched on, gas stations and motels blending into a haze of roadside diners and rain-slicked highways. Ivy dozed off in the back seat, the rhythm of the road lulling her into sleep. Celeste gripped the wheel, mind running in circles. She had no plan beyond getting there. No idea if this was a mistake or the best decision she'd ever made. The sky was darkening when they finally crossed into Seabrook. A thick fog curled around the road, swallowing streetlights and blurring the edges of buildings. The town itself was small, its streets lined with weathered houses, some with peeling shutters, others tidy and well-kept. A few shops dotted the main road, an antique store, a post office, a bait and tackle shop with a hand-painted sign that read Lester's. She parked in front of a diner with a red and white awning, the kind of place where the coffee was always strong and the pie was probably made from scratch. The bell jingled as they stepped inside. The air smelled of fried food and salt from the sea. A few heads turned. The kind of town where strangers were noticed. They slid into a booth near the window. A waitress, somewhere in her 60s with sharp eyes and a name tag that read Dolores, appeared with a pot of coffee. Y'all just passing through? Celeste hesitated. We just moved here. Dolores raised an eyebrow. That so? Not many folks moved to Seabrook. My aunt left me her house, Celeste explained. At this, the chatter in the diner dimmed ever so slightly. A man at the counter, halfway through a plate of fries, looked over. A couple in the next booth exchanged glances. Dolores poured coffee into Celeste's cup, the stream of liquid steady, practiced. Whitmore House? Celeste nodded. Dolores set the pot down. That's a lot of house for just the two of you. Across the room, an old man in a navy blue jacket and cap turned in his seat. His gaze locked onto Celeste with unsettling intensity, as if trying to place her. His face was lined, his hands weathered, the kind of man who had seen things and remembered all of them. Celeste felt an unexpected chill crawl up her spine. Ivy, oblivious, swung her legs under the table. Mom, can I get a milkshake? Celeste forced herself to look away from the old man and back at Dolores. And a grilled cheese? Dolores nodded but didn't move right away. You be careful up there, she said after a beat. Celeste frowned. Why? Dolores just sighed, grabbing her notepad. That house has a long history. A beat of silence passed. Celeste forced a smile. So do I. Dolores studied her for another moment, then turned and walked toward the kitchen. The old man was still staring. Celeste ignored him. Or at least, she tried. The long, winding driveway was nearly swallowed by overgrown grass, the gravel cracking under the weight of the car's tires. Celeste tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the house came into view. Massive. Dark. Victorian spires clawing at the gray sky. The structure was half hidden behind thick ivy, its iron gates rusted and bent. A long-forgotten grandeur, now slipping into something closer to decay. From the back seat, Ivy's voice was barely above a whisper. It's a castle. Celeste swallowed. More like a project. They stepped out, crunching over dead leaves and tangled roots. The house loomed, its wraparound porch lined with peeling paint and carved wooden railings that had once been elegant. A faded brass plaque by the door read Whitmore House. The key from the law office was cold in Celeste's palm as she fitted into the heavy lock. The door groaned open, revealing the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral, like dried lavender left to wither in a forgotten drawer. Celeste reached for the light switch. Nothing. She made a mental note to check if the utilities had been turned on. Ivy stepped inside, wide-eyed. A grand staircase stretched toward the second floor, its steps covered in a tattered Persian runner. A chandelier hung above them, crystals coated in dust, its golden arms frozen mid-twirl. The living room to the right was lined with mahogany bookshelves, their glass doors reflecting the dim light from the tall windows. A piano stood in the corner, its once polished surface now dulled with time. Ivy pressed a key, and the note rang out, thin, fragile, like the house itself was remembering something. Celeste ran a hand over the carved banister. Well, this is unexpected. Ivy pointed to a painting above the fireplace, a portrait of a woman in a dark blue gown, her face eerily similar to Celeste's. She looks like you. Celeste forced a laugh. All serious-looking women from the past looked the same in portraits. Ivy wasn't convinced. I think she looks sad. They moved through the house, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs. The dining room held a long oak table with place settings still arranged as if someone had walked away mid-dinner decades ago. In the kitchen, a heavy iron stove stood beside an icebox, its handle tarnished. Upstairs, the bedrooms were trapped in another time. Four-poster beds draped in faded silks, trunks at the foot filled with clothes that smelled of dust and forgotten perfume. Ivy ran her fingers over an old lace dress. Did Aunt Margaret wear this? Celeste smiled. Probably. Or maybe someone before her. At the end of the hall, a door wouldn't budge. Celeste jiggled the knob, then pushed harder. Locked. She frowned. Ivy tugged at her sleeve. Why would someone lock a room in their own house? Maybe it's storage. Maybe it's a secret. Celeste sighed, making a note to look for another key. It's late. Let's get some sleep. That night, the wind rattled the windows, whistling through the gaps in the old frame. Celeste lay awake, exhaustion heavy but sleep impossible. She listened to Ivy's breathing, steady and safe. Then Ivy whispered, "Mom?" Celeste turned. "What is it?" Ivy's voice was small. "I heard someone talking." Celeste's pulse ticked up. It was probably the wind. Ivy hesitated. "It said my name." Celeste sat up. "Sweetheart, your brain does funny things when you're in a new place. It's just an old house settling. Try to sleep." Ivy didn't argue, but she inched closer, curling up beside her mother under the heavy quilt. Celeste lay awake long after her daughter had drifted off, listening to the house breathe. The next morning, the town's general store smelled like coffee and wood shavings, a mix of fresh produce and something faintly medicinal. A bell jingled as Celeste pushed open the door, Ivy trailing behind. Shelves were lined with jars of homemade preserves, local honey, and bags of saltwater taffy. Behind the counter, a woman with silver hair pinned into a neat bun watched them with sharp eyes. "New in town?" Celeste nodded. "Just moved into Whitmore House." The store went quiet. A man near the produce section stopped mid-reach for an apple. The cashier glanced over her shoulder as if confirming she'd heard correctly. The woman behind the counter, her name tag read Edith, studied Celeste carefully. "Haven't had a Whitmore living in that house in a long time." Celeste forced a smile. "I inherited it from my great-aunt." Edith wiped her hands on her apron. "That house has seen too much grief." Celeste felt the air shift. The people in the store weren't just curious. They were wary. She kept her tone light. "It's just an old house." Edith didn't blink. Old houses don't forget. Celeste gripped her basket a little tighter. Ivy tugged at her sleeve, looking up at her mother with wide eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, rolling in from the sea. Celeste wasn't looking for secrets. She was looking for a broom. The house was still thick with dust, each step stirring up ghosts of forgotten afternoons. Ivy had tracked in mud from the garden, and Celeste, in her attempt to locate anything resembling cleaning supplies, found herself wandering through rooms she hadn't yet explored. That's when she saw it. At the end of the hallway past the sitting room, a door stood apart from the others. Unlike the rest of the house, which had fallen into an elegant sort of decay, this door looked untouched. The brass knob gleamed, the wood unchipped. Celeste tried it. Locked. She stepped back, frowning. Every other room in the house had been left open, as if welcoming her to sift through its forgotten life. But this one had been deliberately sealed. A draft moved through the hall, making the chandelier above her sway slightly. She shivered, more from curiosity than cold. The next hour became a scavenger hunt. She rummaged through drawers, rifled through cabinets, even checked the back of the old grandfather clock in the parlor, half expecting a secret compartment. Nothing. By the time she found the key, she had given up looking for it. She was kneeling by the fireplace, reaching for a stack of old newspapers to toss out, when her fingers brushed something cold. She pulled it from the ashes, rubbing off soot with her thumb. A small iron key, its edges worn smooth. Celeste turned it over in her palm. It was ridiculous to assume it belonged to the study, but she stood and walked back down the hall anyway. The lock clicked open without resistance. The air inside smelled different. Not just of dust, but of ink and old paper, the scent of stories waiting to be told. Sunlight streamed in through a large window, illuminating the desk in the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books in leather bindings, their spines cracked from age. A globe sat in the corner, the kind that spun on an axis, its oceans yellowed. Celeste ran a finger along the desk surface, tracing the faint rings left by long-dried cups of tea. Whoever had last sat here had done so often. She opened the top drawer. Inside, tied together with a frayed blue ribbon, were letters. She sat down, loosening the knot carefully, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. The first was dated 35 years ago. The handwriting was familiar, the loops and curves of the letters unmistakable. Her mother's. Celeste's breath caught as she read. My dearest Henry. I don't know if you'll ever read this. If I'll ever be brave enough to send it. But I find myself unable to forget you, even as I try to build a life far from here. She skimmed the rest, heart pounding. Mentions of stolen afternoons, of laughter, of things left unsaid. The kind of words you wrote when you missed someone the way you weren't supposed to. The next letter was the same. And the next. Then, a name. Henry Caldwell. Celeste sat back, the room too quiet around her. Caldwell wasn't her father's name. Her father's name was Richard Monroe. She sifted through more letters, hands shaking now. Some were responses, written in a heavier hand. You say you want to forget me, but then you write. And I will write back, always. She pressed her fingers to her temples, willing herself to think logically. There could be a dozen explanations. Maybe this Henry was just someone her mother had loved before she met Richard. Maybe this had nothing to do with her. But then she found it. A photograph tucked between the pages, its edges curling with time. A man, his arms slung casually around her mother's shoulders. Celeste had never seen him before. She put the letters down, swallowing against the unease curling in her stomach. At the bottom of the drawer, beneath stacks of yellowed envelopes, was a folded document. The paper crackled as she opened it, revealing a deed. Whitmore Estate, Lot 22. She didn't know what Lot 22 was. She had only been told about the house. Celeste stared at the document, her mother's signature at the bottom, the ink slightly smudged. It had been kept here, away from everything else. Which meant it had been kept from her. A floorboard creaked in the hall. She turned sharply, but the doorway was empty. Just the sound of the house shifting, adjusting to its new inhabitants. She gathered the letters, the photograph, the deed, and carefully placed them back in the drawer. As she locked the study door behind her, she made a decision. She wouldn't tell Ivy. Not yet. Not until she knew what any of this meant. Celeste knew something was wrong the moment she saw the car parked outside the general store. The sleek black Mercedes stuck out like a sore thumb among the battered pickup trucks and salt-rusted sedans lining the street. She stopped mid-step, her stomach knotting as the driver's side door opened. Vincent Drake stepped out, looking as if he had just strolled out of a boardroom, despite the damp coastal air that curled at his collar. He smoothed a hand over his perfectly tailored jacket and flashed the same smile that had once fooled her into thinking he was charming. What a surprise, he said, his voice all polished civility. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. Celeste gripped her grocery bag tighter. You were in the area? I heard about your little inheritance. He gestured vaguely toward the street, as if the town itself were nothing more than a curiosity. Imagine my surprise when I learned you'd packed up and moved to the middle of nowhere. She exhaled slowly, forcing calm. What do you want, Vincent? Just to see how you and Ivy are doing. As if on cue, Ivy's voice rang out from behind her. Dad? Celeste turned to find her daughter standing a few feet away, eyes wide with surprise and something dangerously close to delight. Vincent crouched, arms open. Hey, sweetheart. Ivy hesitated only a second before running to him, throwing her arms around his neck. Celeste's jaw clenched as she watched him hug their daughter, the perfect picture of fatherly affection. You didn't tell me Dad was visiting, Ivy said, pulling back just enough to look at Celeste. He's not, Celeste said flatly. Vincent chuckled, shaking his head as if she were overreacting. I heard you two were adjusting to your new home, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. He glanced down at Ivy. I was just telling your mom I'd love to help. Maybe get the house fixed up, make things a little easier for you both. Ivy's face lit up. Really? Celeste took a step forward. That won't be necessary. But, Mom. Celeste's tone sharpened. Ivy, go wait in the car. Ivy frowned but obeyed, dragging her feet towards Celeste's station wagon. Vincent straightened, amusement flickering across his face. You really are determined to make this difficult, aren't you? Celeste folded her arms. Cut the act, Vincent. What do you really want? He sighed, slipping his hands into his pockets. Fine. I'll be honest. I did some digging into your little inheritance. Turns out the house isn't the only thing you own. The land that comes with it, Lot 22, right, has some interesting value. Ice slid down her spine. Why do you care? Because, he said smoothly, if you're sitting on something valuable, I think we should discuss what that means for Ivy. Celeste's pulse pounded. You don't get to act like you care about her future now. Vincent gave a small, pitying shake of his head. Always so dramatic. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. Stay out of this, Vincent. Stay out of our lives. He held up his hands in mock surrender. I just want to help. Celeste turned on her heel and walked toward the car, leaving him standing there. She gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as she pulled out of the parking lot. Ivy was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. Why are you mad at him? Celeste kept her eyes on the road. I'm not mad. Yes, you are. Celeste sighed, shifting in her seat. Ivy, your dad isn't here to help. He doesn't do anything unless there's something in it for him. That's not true, Ivy said, crossing her arms. He said he wants to make the house better for us. Celeste tightened her grip on the wheel. Did he tell you that, or did he tell you what you wanted to hear? Ivy slumped back into her seat, staring out the window. That night, Celeste barely slept. She kept replaying the conversation, her instinct screaming that Vincent hadn't just shown up out of curiosity. He wanted something. And if he thought it was worth enough, he wouldn't stop until he got it. Sometime after midnight, she heard Ivy whispering. Celeste sat up, blinking against the darkness. Sweetheart? Ivy was curled up under her blankets, her voice hushed. I was just talking. To who? There was a pause. My friend. Celeste felt a chill crawl over her skin. What friend? Ivy hesitated. She doesn't have a name. But she says she used to live here. Celeste's breath hitched. What does she look like? She doesn't let me see her. A shiver prickled down Celeste's spine. When did you start talking to her? Ivy's fingers twisted in the bedsheet. Since we got here. Celeste kept her voice even. What does she say? She asks me if I like it here. If I'm scared. Ivy's voice dropped to a whisper. She says I remind her of someone. Celeste's throat tightened. Ivy, I don't want you talking to. She's nice, Ivy insisted. She said she's lonely. Celeste ran a hand over her face, exhaling slowly. It's late. Get some sleep, okay? Ivy nodded, rolling over. Celeste lay awake long after her daughter had drifted off, listening to the house settle around her. Celeste had never believed in ghosts. She believed in science, in facts, in things that could be explained. But science didn't explain why the kitchen chair she had pushed neatly under the table was now sitting in the middle of the room. Or why the lights in the hallway flickered even though the wiring had been checked twice. Or why she could swear she had left the study door open, only to find it locked again in the morning. She told herself it was just the house settling, that it was old and unpredictable, just like the rest of this town. But then Ivy started complaining about things going missing. "My hairbrush was on the dresser," Ivy said one evening, hands on her hips. "Now it's gone." "Did you check under your bed?" "Yes." "And the bathroom?" "And the kitchen?" Celeste sighed and set down her book. "Things don't just disappear." Ivy crossed her arms. "She probably moved it." Celeste froze. "Who?" Ivy shrugged. "My friend." Something cold pressed against Celeste's spine. "Ivy, what did I say about that?" "She's not bad," Ivy insisted. "She just gets bored." Celeste didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply stood and ruffled Ivy's hair. "I'll help you look." The brush turned up the next morning, sitting perfectly centered on Ivy's pillow. Celeste tried to let it go, to chalk it up to a distracted 8-year-old who had misplaced it and forgotten. But then it started happening to her. Her car keys vanished, only to reappear in the freezer. Her coat moved from the entryway to the upstairs hallway without explanation. And then there was the portrait. She had been wandering through the second floor, still getting used to the vastness of the house, when she pushed open a door she hadn't explored yet. It led to a small room, barely big enough to be called a sitting area, with a single window facing the back of the property. A portrait hung on the wall. A woman in an indigo dress, her dark hair pinned in a low chignon. Her gaze was steady, her features sharp but delicate. There was something familiar about her, something that made Celeste's breath catch. She stepped closer. The woman in the portrait looked exactly like her. Her fingers grazed the edge of the frame. There was no plaque, no signature. Just the woman staring back, as if she had been waiting to be found. Celeste backed away, her pulse uneven. The resemblance wasn't just strong, it was undeniable. She had never seen this portrait before. No one had mentioned it. She left the room without looking back. Later that afternoon, Celeste found herself at the Seabrook Public Library, a squat brick building with a faded sign out front and the unmistakable scent of old paper inside. A bell chimed as she stepped in, the sound making her feel like she had entered a place untouched by time. An older woman sat behind the desk, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She glanced up as Celeste approached. "Looking for something in particular?" Celeste hesitated before clearing her throat. "I inherited Whitmore House." The librarian stilled. She set her book down carefully. "That so?" Celeste nodded. "I was hoping to find some history on the property." The librarian studied her, then pushed up from her chair. "Follow me." They wound through narrow aisles until they reached a set of filing cabinets. The librarian, her name tag read Margaret, pulled open a drawer and flipped through the folders until she found what she was looking for. She handed Celeste a thin, yellowed newspaper. "April 12, 1891, Margaret said. Celeste unfolded it gently. The article was short, the ink faded, but the words hit her like a brick. "Tragedy at Whitmore Estate, fire claims the lives of the Caldwell family." The Caldwells. Her hands tightened around the paper as she skimmed the details. A fire had broken out in the middle of the night. Neighbors had seen the glow from the hillside but arrived too late. The house, the one that had stood before hers, had burned to the ground. Only one person had escaped, a woman, unnamed. Celeste's mind raced. Henry Caldwell. The name from the letters in the locked study. The man who had written to her mother. She looked up sharply. "Do you know who the surviving woman was?" Margaret held her gaze for a long moment. "Some things are better left buried." Celeste exhaled. "Please." The librarian pursed her lips. "The stories say she stayed in Seabrook. But she never spoke of that night. And no one ever spoke of her." Celeste folded the paper carefully, her pulse pounding. Margaret's voice softened. If you dig too deep, you might not like what you find. Celeste nodded, slipping the article into her bag. She turned to leave, but just before she stepped outside, the librarian called after her. Be careful, Ms. Monroe. Some houses don't forget. Celeste stepped into the cold air, the weight of history pressing against her chest. Celeste hadn't seen Vincent in over a week, and that alone put her on edge. He was the kind of man who moved in obvious ways, dinners at the best restaurants, business deals made in full view of the people he wanted to impress. Silence from him was unnatural. The call came while she was in the kitchen, sorting through an old wooden drawer that had a habit of sticking. The phone rang, and without thinking, she picked it up, tucking it between her ear and shoulder. Celeste, Vincent's voice was smooth, deliberate. How's our little house on the hill? She gritted her teeth. What do you want? I've been having some very interesting conversations, he continued, ignoring her hostility. Turns out there's a developer in town, Daniel Blackwell. You'd like him. Local guy, big ideas, very eager to buy up old land like yours. Celeste felt her grip tighten around the edge of the drawer. Not interested. See, that's the thing, Vincent said, his tone dipping into something more calculated. I think you should be. Blackwell's a smart man. He's offering a lot of money for a property that, let's be honest, is barely standing. You and Ivy could be comfortable for once instead of, what is it you're doing now? Playing house in a ghost story? Celeste exhaled through her nose, forcing her voice to stay level. I don't care how much he's offering. I figured you'd say that. A pause. Then, softer, deadlier, Ivy deserves better. The room seemed to shrink around her. Excuse me? You've always been emotional, Vincent said, as if explaining something to a child. Making rash decisions. You moved her to an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, away from her school, her friends, from stability. You don't get to talk about stability, Celeste snapped. Vincent sighed. You've had your fun, but let's be realistic. A court would see things my way. It wouldn't take much for me to make the case that you're unfit. I'm not unreasonable, Celeste. Sell the house. Take the money. Make things easier for yourself. Celeste's hand shook as she ended the call, pressing the phone down onto the counter as if trying to crush the words that had come out of it. Ivy was sitting at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in her drawings, her crayons scattered in front of her. Celeste inhaled, forcing the tension out of her body before turning. Sweetheart, can you come here? Ivy looked up. I'm finishing something. Celeste walked over instead, kneeling beside the table. Ivy had filled an entire sheet of paper with thick black crayon, smudging the edges with the side of her hand. In the center of the darkness, a woman stood alone. Her face was indistinct, but her posture was unmistakable, slumped, lost. Celeste's skin prickled. Who is this? Ivy tapped the page. She cries at night. Celeste's mouth went dry. What? Ivy shrugged, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to say. I hear her sometimes. She stands in the hallway. But she never comes inside my room. A chill ran through Celeste's spine. What else does she do? She talks, Ivy said simply. But I can't always understand her. Celeste struggled to find something, anything, to say. Have you told me this before? Ivy glanced at her, frowning. You didn't want me to talk about her. Celeste sat back on her heels. She had brushed it off, dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but something about the way Ivy said it, the absolute certainty in her voice, made it impossible to ignore now. That night, Celeste stayed awake long after Ivy had fallen asleep. Every creak in the house, every shift of the wind against the windows, every flickering light felt like something just out of reach, something waiting to be acknowledged. The wall crumbled in her hands, the plaster breaking apart in uneven chunks, sending a fine mist of dust into the air. Celeste coughed, waving it away, her heart pounding in her chest. The weak spot in the upstairs hallway had caught her attention earlier that day, a section where the wallpaper had bubbled and cracked, almost as if the house itself were trying to push something out. Now, as she peeled back the layers, her fingers hit something solid, something that wasn't brick or wood. She reached inside, feeling the cool edges of an object buried deep within the wall. With one final tug, it broke free, sending a cascade of dust over her lap. A book. The leather was dry, the edges brittle, but it held together as she turned it over in her hands. A journal. Celeste sat back on her heels, brushing off the thick layer of dirt, her breath uneven. The name etched onto the front in faded gold lettering made her stomach flip. Eleanor Whitmore. Her great-grandmother. The pages crackled as she opened it, the ink faded but still legible in looping cursive. I write this knowing it may never be read, that the truth may stay buried with me. But if these words are found, if someone is reading them, know that I was not what they said I was. Know that the crime I was accused of was not mine to bear. Celeste skimmed through the entries, her fingers trembling as she turned the fragile pages. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a woman who had been vilified, cast out, her name dragged through the dirt over something she had never done. They came in the night, torches in hand, shouting my name like a curse. I begged them to listen, but the truth did not matter. A lie, once spoken enough times, becomes fact. And I was their villain. Celeste swallowed hard, the weight of the words pressing against her ribs. Eleanor had lived in this house. Walked these halls. Slept beneath the same roof. And she had died in disgrace. She turned another page, her pulse quickening as she read on. There is a way out. A way to clear the name they've tarnished. It is hidden, deep beneath the house, where no man has dared to look. But if found, it will not bring peace. It will bring ruin. Celeste's breath hitched. A hidden passage? What had Eleanor meant? She flipped through the rest of the journal, but the pages grew incoherent, the words more frantic, as if Eleanor had been writing in a panic. Then, near the end, a final warning. If you seek it, be swift. They will not let the past stay buried forever. A chill crept over Celeste's skin. That night, sleep did not come easily. The journal sat on her nightstand, its presence both heavy and impossible to ignore. The wind rattled against the windows, the old house groaning with the weight of its secrets. Somewhere in the haze of half-sleep, she heard it. A voice, soft and urgent. Find it before they do. Celeste's eyes snapped open, her breath coming in short gasps. The room was still, the air thick with something unseen. She was no longer sure if she was imagining things. Or if someone, was trying to make sure she listened. Celeste had never liked the basement. Even before she had any real reason to fear it, the place unsettled her in a way that had nothing to do with its damp smell or the way the single bare light bulb cast long, uncertain shadows across the stone walls. It was the silence that bothered her most, the thick, suffocating kind that made her feel like she wasn't alone, even when she knew she was. But the journal had led her here. Eleanor's frantic words had played over and over in her mind all night, each sentence a warning, a plea. The truth was buried deep beneath the house. And now, so was Celeste. She stepped carefully over the uneven floor, her flashlight beam bouncing off rusted metal shelving and stacks of forgotten trunks. The house had been built atop the ruins of the one that had burned, and it showed. The stone foundation was older than the walls above, the seams rough and uneven, as if someone had pieced it together in a hurry. Her fingers trailed along the wall, searching for anything out of place. Then, just beneath an old wooden worktable, her hand brushed over a jagged edge. A stone, looser than the others. She crouched, heart pounding as she wedged her fingertips into the crack and pulled. The stone groaned as it shifted, dust raining onto her hands. With one last shove, it came free, revealing a dark, narrow passage just beyond. Celeste hesitated, listening. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. She took a breath and slipped inside. The tunnel was colder than the basement, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old coins or rusted iron. The walls were rough-hewn, barely wide enough for her to move comfortably, and the floor sloped downward, leading her deeper beneath the house. Her flashlight flickered. She tightened her grip and pressed forward. The passage twisted, narrowing, until finally, she stumbled into a small chamber. At its center sat a chest. The wood was dark with age, the iron hinges rusted but still intact. Celeste wiped her palms against her jeans before reaching out, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the surface. The latch was stiff but not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of crumbling fabric, were gold coins, their surfaces dulled with time but unmistakable in their weight and shine. Documents lay beside them, their edges curled, the ink faded but still legible. Celeste carefully lifted one, unfolding it with steady hands. A legal contract. A confession. A document that cleared Eleanor Whitmore's name. A sharp breath caught in her throat. This was it. The proof. She reached back into the chest, her fingers grazing something cool and delicate. She pulled out a locket, its chain tangled, the metal still gleaming beneath a fine layer of dust. She pried it open with her thumb. Inside was a photograph. A woman in an indigo dress. Eleanor. The house groaned above her. The walls trembled, a slow, creeping shudder that moved through the tunnel like a living thing. Dust rained from the ceiling, and somewhere behind her, the sound of shifting stone sent her pulse racing. Celeste grabbed the documents and shoved them into her coat pocket. She clutched the locket tight, heart hammering as she turned back toward the tunnel. She didn't hear the footsteps above. Didn't see the way the basement door had been left open, just wide enough for someone to listen. Didn't realize that Vincent knew exactly what she had found. Celeste woke to the sound of glass shattering. Her mind scrambled for an explanation, a fallen picture frame, a storm blowing debris against the window, but before she could fully surface from sleep, another crash echoed through the house. The unmistakable sound of something being smashed. She bolted upright. The bedside clock glowed 2:13 a.m. The house was dark except for the sliver of moonlight spilling in through the curtains. Ivy was asleep, curled on her side, one arm wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. Celeste's pulse hammered against her ribs. Then came the voices. Low, hushed, but unmistakably male. She slid out of bed, moving slowly, carefully. Her breath felt too loud, her heartbeat a drum against the silence. She reached for her phone, but the screen showed no service. The storm earlier must have knocked out the signal again. Another crash. Closer. Ivy stirred. Mom? Celeste pressed a finger to her lips. Stay here, she whispered, pulling the covers over Ivy's small frame. Don't move. Barefoot, she crept toward the hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath her, betraying her presence. She clenched her jaw and pushed forward. Light flickered from downstairs. Not the warm glow of a lamp but the sharp, erratic beam of a flashlight. Shadows moved against the walls, stretching and shifting. Then, a voice she knew too well. Find it. Vincent. She pressed herself against the wall, blood roaring in her ears. He wasn't alone. She counted at least 3 sets of footsteps, heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. A loud thump, furniture overturning. A grunt of frustration. Where is it? Celeste swallowed hard. He knew. He had seen her in the basement. He had waited. And now he had come to take what he thought was his. She darted back into the bedroom, her mind racing. Ivy sat up, eyes wide. Mom, what's? Celeste grabbed her hand. We have to go. They had barely reached the top of the stairs when a voice rang out. Celeste. She froze. Vincent stood in the foyer, flashlight in one hand, a crowbar dangling from the other. His suit was immaculate as always, but there was something different about him now. His usual smooth confidence had sharpened into something colder. Behind him, two men continued their destruction. A glass cabinet lay shattered, its contents strewn across the floor. The sofa cushions had been slashed open, feathers spilling out like snowfall. He took a step forward. Where is it? Celeste pulled Ivy behind her. Get out. Vincent sighed as if she were being unreasonable. You've been playing detective. Digging up things that should have stayed buried. He gestured toward the mess around him. I don't have time for games, Celeste. Hand it over. Her grip on Ivy tightened. There's nothing here. Vincent tilted his head. Lying never suited you. One of the men kicked over a chair. Another yanked books from the shelves, tossing them aside in frustration. Ivy whimpered. Mom. Celeste took a step back, her voice low and firm. Let us go, Vincent. Whatever you think I have, it's not worth this. Vincent exhaled through his nose, as if deciding something. Then he lifted his hand. A small silver lighter gleamed in his palm. Celeste's stomach dropped. He flicked it open. A small flame danced at the tip. You're making this difficult, he said, almost bored. And I really hate difficult. Before she could react, he turned and tossed the lighter onto the sofa. The fire caught instantly, flames licking at the fabric, devouring the stuffing. Heat roared to life, casting shadows across the walls. Ivy screamed. Celeste grabbed her, pulling her toward the back staircase, but Vincent stepped in front of them. You'll get out when I get what I want, he said, his voice calm. The fire spread fast, climbing the curtains, leaping to the wooden beams above. Smoke thickened the air. The house groaned, the old wood protesting against the sudden, violent heat. Celeste coughed, her eyes burning. You're insane. Vincent smirked. Not insane. Just motivated. A loud crack split through the air as a section of the ceiling collapsed, embers raining down like fireflies. The two men who had been searching finally seemed to grasp the severity of the situation. One bolted for the door. The other hesitated, then cursed and followed. Vincent turned toward the staircase, where the fire was already creeping upward. Celeste didn't wait. She yanked Ivy toward the side exit, the one that led to the garden. The smoke was suffocating now, every breath an effort. Mom, I can't, Ivy coughed, stumbling. Celeste lifted her into her arms and ran. Behind her, the house moaned like a living thing, its bones breaking, its walls buckling. The flames swallowed everything, the heat pressing against her back, urging her forward. They burst through the back door just as the roof caved in. Celeste collapsed onto the grass, Ivy still clutched against her. Heat pulsed from the burning house, turning the air thick and hazy. The flames roared, consuming Whitmore House, consuming history. Celeste turned, chest heaving, and watched as everything she had fought to protect was swallowed by fire. The flames devoured everything. Celeste stood on the grass, gripping Ivy so tightly that she could feel her daughter's racing heartbeat against her own. The fire roared, sending plumes of thick black smoke curling into the night sky, and the house, her great-grandmother's house, the house that had kept secrets buried for over a century, was disappearing before her eyes. Screams of sirens pierced the night as fire trucks rumbled down the gravel driveway. Firefighters moved fast, shouting orders over the crackling inferno. Water blasted from the hoses, but Celeste already knew there wasn't much they could save. The house was too old, too dry. It had been waiting for something like this. A section of the roof collapsed, sending sparks flying. Celeste flinched, her arms still wrapped protectively around Ivy, who buried her face into her mother's shoulder. Then she saw it. Through the haze of smoke and fire, as the flames licked away at the old wooden walls, something shifted. A section of the structure groaned and buckled, but instead of collapsing, a piece of the wall behind the staircase crumbled inward, revealing a dark space beyond it. A hidden room. Celeste sucked in a sharp breath. The firefighters must have seen it too, because two of them rushed toward the opening, ducking beneath the falling debris. Minutes stretched into eternity as they worked, and then a voice rang out from inside. "We've got something here." Celeste's legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move closer. The firefighters emerged from the hidden space, carrying soot-covered objects in their arms, framed paintings, stacks of papers, and, finally, a heavy metal box sealed shut with rusted clasps. One of them approached her. "Ma'am, these were in a hidden chamber behind the main staircase. It looks like they were untouched by the fire." She reached out, her fingers brushing over the metal lid. It was cold, solid, real. Everything else was ash, but this had survived. Ivy peered up, her voice small. "Mom? What is it?" Celeste shook her head. She didn't know yet. As the firefighters continued their work, she kneeled beside the metal box and pried it open. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were more documents, old, yellowed, but miraculously preserved. And beneath them, a thick bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out one of the papers, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor. It was a legal document. An ownership deed. The words on the page blurred as her eyes scanned them. This wasn't just proof that Eleanor had been innocent, it was proof that the land itself, the very thing Vincent had been so eager to steal, had always belonged to the Whitmore family. And now, to her. A sharp voice cut through the chaos. "Celeste." She turned just as two police officers hauled Vincent forward, his hands cuffed behind his back. His face was a mask of rage, his pristine suit now streaked with ash. "This is absurd," he barked, twisting against the officer's grip. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." One of the officers ignored him and turned to Celeste. "We've received multiple reports of trespassing, arson, and property damage linked to Mr. Drake. Not to mention the financial manipulation surrounding your inheritance. We'll be taking him into custody." Vincent's gaze locked onto hers. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was lower now, more controlled, but the venom was still there. "You're still nothing without me." Celeste exhaled, standing taller. "I was always something without you." He opened his mouth to respond, but the officers pulled him away. Celeste looked down at the papers in her hands. The fire had taken so much, but not this. Not the truth. That had survived. The cottage was small, but it had good bones. That was what the landlord had said when Celeste signed the lease, and standing in the middle of the modest living room, she decided he was right. The windows let in soft morning light, the floorboards creaked in a way that felt lived in rather than haunted, and the kitchen, though tiny, smelled of fresh wood polish instead of smoke and ruin. It was nothing like Whitmore House. It was nothing like the life she had before either. But it was theirs. Ivy ran through the hallway, inspecting every corner like a real estate agent surveying a new listing. "The yard is big enough for a swing set," she announced from the back door. Celeste smiled, setting down the last of their moving boxes. "Then I guess we'll have to get one." Ivy beamed, then hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be there. Celeste waited, holding her breath, but after a moment, Ivy shook her head and ran outside. She hadn't mentioned the crying woman in weeks. Celeste exhaled, feeling something settle in her chest. The house was gone, the fire taking its secrets with it. Whatever had been lingering there, whether it was guilt or history or something less explainable, had let go of Ivy along with it. She had to let go, too. The next few weeks were busy in a way that felt good. Normal. She met with contractors, signed papers, made calls. The funds recovered from the hidden chamber had been more than enough to set things in motion. Enough to start the clinic she had dreamed of for years but had always told herself was too far out of reach. The building had been sitting vacant at the edge of town for years. Used to be a post office, the owner had told her when she inquired about the sale. But Seabrook doesn't send much mail anymore. She walked through the empty space, imagining exam rooms where sorting stations had been, replacing the echo of her footsteps with the sounds of children laughing, the soft hum of a place where people came to heal. The town watched with cautious curiosity. When she had first arrived, she had been a stranger. A Whitmore. Someone who had stirred up old history in a place where history preferred to rest. But things were different now. The woman at the general store, who had once narrowed her eyes at Celeste's presence, now slipped an extra muffin into her bag with a quiet, "For Ivy." The librarian, who had warned her to leave things buried, had come by to donate a stack of children's books for the waiting room. Even Edith, the woman who had first told her the house had seen too much grief, had stopped her on Main Street. "You're staying, then?" Celeste had smiled, feeling, for the first time, like she could say it without hesitation. "I think I am." The clinic was set to open in a month. There was still work to be done, permits, equipment, the endless little details that came with starting something new, but she didn't mind. This wasn't something she was running from. This was something she was building. She picked Ivy up from school one afternoon, and they stopped by the lot on the way home. The sign out front had gone up that morning. Whitmore Pediatric Clinic. Ivy studied it for a long moment. "Does that mean you're the boss?" Celeste laughed. "It means I get to help people the way I want to." Ivy nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then she reached for Celeste's hand, swinging their arms as they walked back to the car. "I think she's happy now," Ivy said suddenly. Celeste blinked. "Who?" Ivy hesitated, then shrugged. "No one." Celeste squeezed her daughter's hand, the warmth of it grounding her. Whatever ghosts had followed them here, they had left now. And this time, they were staying. Celeste wasn't looking for anything beyond what she already had. She had Ivy, she had the clinic, she had a house that didn't creak ominously at night. That was enough. More than enough. So when Ryan Caldwell showed up at her clinic with a box of artifacts pulled from the wreckage of Whitmore House, she was polite. Grateful, even. But that was it. This was all they could recover, he said, setting the box down on the counter. "Figured you'd want it." Celeste dusted off her hands and peered inside. A few scorched photo frames, a silver candlestick, the metal box that had held Eleanor's letters. The documents inside had survived, miraculously, but the rest of the house was gone. She let out a breath. "Thank you." Ryan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You don't have to say it like I'm here out of pity." Celeste shot him a look. "I wasn't." "You were." He smirked. "It's okay. I get it." He was infuriatingly easygoing for someone who had pulled her and Ivy from a burning house just a few weeks ago. He had been the one to wrap a blanket around her shoulders when she was still coughing up smoke, the one who had carried Ivy to the ambulance when Celeste's legs had refused to move. And now here he was, standing in her clinic like he belonged there, like they were two ordinary people having an ordinary conversation. She picked up one of the photo frames, the edges blackened, the glass missing. "I didn't know firefighters had an interest in historical preservation." He shrugged. "We don't." "But I do." Celeste raised an eyebrow. Ryan tapped a finger against the side of the box. "Caldwell." She blinked. "Henry Caldwell," he continued. "Ring a bell?" Celeste stared at him. Ryan chuckled. "Didn't think so. He was my great-great-grandfather." She set the frame down carefully. You're related to Henry Caldwell? Last I checked. Celeste crossed her arms. And you're just now bringing this up? Ryan rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly sheepish. Look, I didn't want to get into it while your house was on fire. That was very considerate of you. You're welcome. Celeste exhaled, still trying to wrap her mind around it. So what, you've always known about Eleanor? Ryan shook his head. I knew the family story. The fire. The scandal. But no one ever talked about what really happened. Then you showed up, and suddenly people were remembering things. Celeste glanced down at the metal box. The letters, the deeds, the truth that had been hidden for generations. Ryan nudged the box with his foot. I think we should go through this together. She hesitated. He smiled, softer this time. Just to piece the story together. That's all. Celeste wasn't sure why she believed him. Maybe it was the way he had carried Ivy out of the burning house without hesitation. Or the way he didn't push, didn't demand. Or maybe it was just the way she wanted to. The metal box sat open on Celeste's kitchen table, its contents spread out like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The smell of old paper lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh coffee. Ivy was at school, and Ryan had just left after spending the morning helping her sort through the surviving documents. She ran her fingers over the yellowed pages, smoothing out the creases, her eyes scanning the handwritten notes, the official seals, the brittle edges of a history long buried. Some of it she already knew, Eleanor's innocence, the proof that the land had always belonged to the Whitmore family. But there was something else. At the very bottom of the stack, beneath faded deeds and tax records, was a rolled-up sheet of parchment, stiff with age. She carefully unrolled it, her breath catching when she saw what it was. A map. Seabrook, drawn in careful ink, but different. The roads weren't quite where they should be. The coastline had shifted, the markers of old properties stretching farther than they did now. And in the center, surrounding the burned remains of Whitmore House, was a vast section of land marked with a name she hadn't seen before. Caldwell Whitmore Estate. Her stomach turned as she traced the borders with her fingertip. It was bigger than she expected, extending beyond the property lines Vincent had so desperately tried to claim. She grabbed one of the legal documents from the pile, scanning the details. The land deeds Vincent had been using to justify his claims, the ones he had tried to sell off to developers, were based on newer records. But this map, this document, was older. Legally binding. And it proved, beyond any doubt, that most of the land Vincent had tried to sell had never actually belonged to him. Celeste sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. For months, Vincent had fought for control, believing he had found something valuable. And he had. Just not in the way he thought. The land had always belonged to her family. Which meant she could decide what to do with it. By the time Ivy got home from school, Celeste had made up her mind. She stood in the kitchen, flipping through the map one last time as Ivy set her backpack on the floor. What's that? Ivy asked, peering over her shoulder. Celeste smiled, folding the parchment carefully. A new plan. She would return the land to the town. Not to developers. Not to people like Vincent, who only saw dollar signs where history lived. She would make sure it became something real, schools, parks, places where families could build something that lasted. Something no one could ever take away again. The ruins of Whitmore House still smelled of smoke. The air had shifted since the fire, where there had once been towering walls and shadowed hallways, there was now open sky. The remnants of the mansion sat in a jagged heap of charred beams and collapsed stone, the weight of a century reduced to ash. Celeste hadn't planned to return. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing that hadn't been swallowed by the flames. But when Ivy asked if they could visit, she couldn't bring herself to say no. They walked carefully through what remained, stepping over broken wood and scorched earth. The once grand staircase was a skeletal frame of blackened wood, barely holding itself together. The fireplace, the one that had warmed generations before them, now stood alone in a pile of rubble. Ivy stopped near the remnants of the parlor, where the floors had caved in. She crouched down, tilting her head. "Mom," she called, her voice hushed with something that wasn't quite excitement, not quite fear. "Look." Celeste moved toward her boots crunching against brittle debris. Ivy was holding something in her small hands, dusted with soot but unmistakable in its shape. A locket. Celeste inhaled sharply, recognizing the delicate metal, the faint etching of vines along the edges. Eleanor's locket. The same one she had found in the underground chamber. The same one she had clutched in her hands the night Vincent had set the fire. She thought it had been lost in the chaos, consumed by the flames along with everything else. Yet here it was. She knelt beside Ivy, brushing away the dirt with trembling fingers. The metal was warm, as if it had been waiting for them. Slowly, she pried it open. Inside, the faded photograph of Eleanor remained, untouched by time. But it wasn't just the photo that made Celeste's breath catch. Tucked beneath it was a small slip of paper, singed at the edges but still readable. The handwriting was faded but familiar, the ink smudged as if written in a hurry. "For the one who will set things right." Celeste stared at the words, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She had spent months thinking this was about inheritance, about proving something to Vincent, about saving what she could. But it was never about ownership. It was never about money. It was about restoring what had been taken. Ivy touched the locket gently. "She left it for you." Celeste swallowed, her throat tight. Maybe she did. She closed the locket carefully, holding it in her palm. Some things weren't meant to be buried. Some things found their way back, no matter what. The autumn air in Seabrook smelled of salt and wood smoke, the kind of crispness that signaled shorter days and longer nights. Celeste stood in the town square, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, watching as people gathered, talking in low, expectant voices. A wooden platform had been set up in front of the courthouse, draped with a simple banner that read Eleanor Whitmore, a legacy restored. She hadn't expected a ceremony. The town had never been quick to embrace change, let alone acknowledge past mistakes. But as word spread about the recovered documents, the ones proving Eleanor's innocence, the ones that had survived fire and secrecy, something shifted. People began to talk. About the way history had been rewritten. About the weight of old rumors. About the kind of justice that took a century to arrive. The mayor, a wiry man with silver hair and an ever-present mug of coffee, stepped onto the platform. He cleared his throat, tapping the microphone twice before speaking. "There's something to be said about the truth," he began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "It has a way of coming back, no matter how long it's been buried." Celeste's fingers tightened around the locket hanging beneath her sweater. "For too many years," the mayor continued, "this town failed to recognize the truth about Eleanor Whitmore. We let fear, gossip, and time distort her story. But today, we set that right." A framed portrait of Eleanor had been placed at the center of the stage. Celeste had chosen it from the recovered artifacts, the same photograph she had found in the locket. The same one Ivy had drawn, over and over, before the house burned. She was never the villain of this story, the mayor said. She was its victim. And now, finally, she can be remembered as she was, someone who fought for what was hers. Someone who deserved better. A ripple of applause moved through the crowd, quiet but genuine. Celeste let out a slow breath, the tightness in her chest loosening. It wasn't everything, but it was something. As the ceremony ended, people came up to her, shaking her hand, offering words that might have felt hollow months ago but now carried weight. "You did right by her," Edith said, her weathered hands gripping Celeste's tightly. Celeste nodded. She deserved it. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet, Celeste spotted Ivy across the square. She was running through the grass, her laughter bright and unburdened, the way a child should be. Ryan stepped up beside her, hands in his pockets. "You okay?" Celeste smiled, watching Ivy spin in circles, her arms outstretched like she could catch the wind. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am." Ryan tilted his head toward her. "You ever think about leaving?" She glanced around, the town square, the people, the place that had once felt so foreign but now felt like something else entirely. "Not anymore." Ryan nodded. "Good." Celeste exhaled, feeling something settle inside her. The ghosts were gone now, the house reduced to memory, the past laid to rest. What remained was this: an open sky, a girl laughing, a future she had chosen. And, finally, a place that felt like home.